Let's get this wild conversation started. And welcome to the Wild Conversation, where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, we get to hear from Dr. Rob McKenna, named among the top 30 most influential IO psychologists and featured in Forbes. Dr. McKenna is the founder of Wild Leaders Inc. and the Wild Foundation, and the creator of the Wild Trust platform. His recent TEDx, Becoming a Whole Leader in a Broken World, is a manifesto on the critical role that developing whole and intentional leaders will play in our future. Dr. McKenna has devoted his life to developing leaders and transforming the way we see people in our organizations, seeing and developing them as whole. So here's Dr. McKenna.
Whenever I think of vulnerability, the first thing that comes to mind is a castle. And maybe I have some subconscious obsession with all things medieval, but for whatever reason, I think of these structures from the time of knights and kingdoms. And while my experience with castles is limited to TV shows, travels in Europe, fairy tales, and books about that time period, there is something about castles that makes me think of their necessary construction as both places that are closed and places that are safe and secure, and places where an entire community of people will pass through so that they can be open. And if I were to build a castle in the middle of a kingdom, I would want it to have both of those attributes: an openness where people could come and go as they please, and an equal capacity to shut our gates, raise our drawbridges, and protect all of those same people from the dangers lurking outside of it. And in many ways, people are like castles. Our reality isn't only about being open, but also about being safe and secure. It would be a lot easier if the castles of our lives were defined as one or the other, but it just doesn't work that way. Openness is important, but equally important is that feeling of safety. And one of the castles in our world today is the modern elementary school. Our schools are representations of this. And I know at a time that this is can be a very sensitive topic, it's a reality. And so I think it's something that we have to talk about. And in the near past, the common construction of an elementary school or a middle school or a high school, by the way, where kids would come to learn and play was defined by openness. Open spaces, large windows, inviting front doors, and classrooms that were accessible, defined what it meant to build a school. Those things are still important today, but a shift has taken place for schools that are safe over schools that are open. And that shift created an architectural dilemma, if you look at schools, where those same open structures are now surrounded by a wall or a fence or a gate that visually interrupts the original intent of those schools. And just looking at them is a vivid example of the fundamental tension we feel, even as human beings, between remaining open and feeling safe. And while safety and openness are the tensions we feel in the architecture of our lives, the questions regarding our level of vulnerability are the keys to understanding them more fully. And here's the challenge of vulnerability, though. One size does not fit all people, but we buy into ideas that do. And vulnerability has become fashionable as the solution to our problems of shame, of regret, of reluctance, and deeper relational connections. And while mustering the courage to be our whole selves is absolutely critical for so many of us, it is not the panacea it promises for some. And vulnerability is not the only solution to our relational and personal dilemmas, especially when it comes to leaders. Vulnerability likely looks different for different people, because some of us struggle with vulnerability because we're afraid we will be discovered for the fraud we feel like we are. Some of us struggle with vulnerability because of our, let's say, our compulsion to please others or to make others comfortable. Others of us struggle with vulnerability because we know we may appear weak, and that's the last thing we want. I think so many of us experience that. And some of us, quite frankly, struggle with vulnerability because the context and people around us makes it clear that vulnerability isn't helpful and is actually somewhat overrated. And the most common experience most of us have had is that moment where we cry in public and feel compelled to apologize for it. I apologize. I'm getting emotional. What is it within us that causes us to say, I'm sorry, I got emotional? And your answer probably depends on which of the four categories you identified with. The common factor is our discomfort with showing people what's really going on inside of us, especially if what's going on is full of uncertainty, unanswered questions, inappropriateness, doubt, fear, or maybe even shame. And in a culture that celebrates vulnerability as the solution to our problems, often today, this is not in the past, but I think today we see this, I want to be thoughtful about its application. If our world was perfect and people did not have the capacity to do evil with what they know, and we didn't have that same capacity within us, vulnerability would be easy and constant. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world that is both redeeming and broken at the same time. And no one understands this tensions in vulnerability better than my friends in the physical safety and security world. These are the leaders whose job it is to manage the access that human beings have to physical spaces. Shopping malls, schools, grocery stores, universities, parades, movie theaters, and even corporate buildings. These leaders are responsible for creating an environment that feels welcoming and open while being safe and secure. That's their job every day. It's also the job of every law enforcement officer you know. We want police officers who will listen to us, protect us, and oftentimes even protect us from ourselves. And parents learn this early on. So much of parenting is about creating openness for learning and risk with an equal dose of safety. That baby will stand up and walk. That baby that will stand up and walk will never learn to walk without falling multiple times in the process. And if openness and safety define one of the most important tensions in our lives, questions regarding our level of vulnerability are the recipe for thoughtful and intentional movements forward. And the level of vulnerability each of us might display is wonderfully nuanced and personal. The thing to be mindful of is the reason behind our willingness to be vulnerable and our resistance to people seeing us for who we really are, risking that what they see will be only part of the whole story. But vulnerability is powerful. There's no doubt about it.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our Wild Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.
Vulnerability is so powerful and so important. If you've ever felt the magical and transcendent moment in any meeting when someone shares something that is obviously challenging to share, you know what I mean. We need it so desperately to ground our reality and humanity. We're drawn in herds to anyone who opens the door to their own pain and suffering. We relate to it. Our souls long for someone who will remind us we are not alone, especially the most surprising people who on the outside appear to have it all together. Isn't that powerful when you see it? These moments where someone has the courage to lift the veil that so many keep firmly in place. Those moments are powerful, and raising vulnerability as a one size fits all solution is only half the story. It is a limited story. We've got to tell the whole story. Each year, the faculty in a graduate program I led for many years participated in a fishbowl conversation in front of 70 to 80 of our graduate students. And I think students enjoyed it because many of them know us as individuals, but when we are in a real conversation with one another, the faculty that I worked with day to day, the dynamics were different. And we would often get vulnerable and real. We had worked together as friends and colleagues for somewhere between 15 and 20 years. So the conversation was usually lively and sometimes ended up somewhere important. And we spent so much time together that we understood each other's strengths, our unique contributions, our picadillos, our even many of our insecurities. And while some of my students knew me well and more fully understood the container that held my identity, my character, and my leadership capacity, not all of them did. And over the years, this fishbowl experience, we would do this in front of all those students, unlocked some powerful moments of vulnerability for me. And in one instance, another faculty member asked me if I had any regrets. It's a big question. And while I do have regrets and things I wish I had done differently or people that I had treated differently, I've never thought of myself as someone with a lot of regrets. But in that moment, I realized I do have one. I said, I wish my wife and I had a third child. I'm still hesitant to share this now because there are all kinds of reasons we may not have a third child, even as I share this with you now. And without more explanation, you might make assumptions about me or about us as a couple. You might be thinking that one of us couldn't physically have a third child, or that our marriage was struggling, or that we thought we were too old. And the story I told the students was that my back pain was so severe in the season where our kids were being born that I was doing all I could to exist well as a husband and a father with our two boys and my wife, let alone imagining having more kids. But even that's probably not the whole story. My wife certainly understood my back pain, but I don't think either of us fully understood why we were making the choices we were and the other variables that were in play. And in a fishbowl conversation a year later, each faculty member was asked to describe the reason. This is crazy. Imagine doing this with the team that you work with. Describe the reason why each of us would be voted off the island. As if we were participants in some show where the participants got to vote and the team members got to vote. My answer was accurate, swift, on point, and incomplete. When it came to my turn, I said, the reason why I think you would vote me off the island is that you will realize I'm not smart enough to be here. And to bring more honesty to my moment of vulnerability, I'm not sure I believe that statement. I'm saying that I'm not sure that that was actually true, that I believe it, but it's certainly partially true. I didn't even regret saying it when I said it, but I had some regrets later. I know that some of our students, and maybe the most important ones, were probably encouraged that the leader of their department sometimes felt underqualified in all kinds of ways to have his job. But I also knew that some understood that partial truth as a statement of fact. I hated the moment when a student who didn't know me very well felt the necessity of comforting me for having said what I said. What made me even more than that, what what I guess bothered me more was him highlighting the very real possibility that I had been misunderstood by many. Vulnerability takes courage. Even to tell you what I just told you risks you making assumptions about me based on what I just said, about why it would bother me. But do you really know the whole story? At the end of the day, vulnerability takes courage because it opens you up to the possibility of being misunderstood. And that is the real deal. If vulnerability is the catalyst for mutual understanding, for trust, and for change, being misunderstood is the curse we run from when it gets real. And why do we care so much about avoiding being misunderstood, even more than we care about being understood? What is it about our character as human beings that cares so much that others get us right and see us as we want them to see us for who we really are? And there's something about our character that wants to control the story, especially as it relates to how others read into our story. And the double-edged sword of vulnerability is that it opens the first chapter of the book, but we risk the reader writing the rest. And what would it take for us to more frequently open ourselves up and more effectively manage the pressure to control where things go next? And it probably requires us to understand vulnerability a little better, because vulnerability is quite literally defined as an openness to being hurt. There's no way around that. Vulnerability is not the same as connection, although it may be necessary to create it. Using vulnerability as a pathway to relationships with a discounted definition of its costs ignores the reality that there could be very real consequences for opening ourselves up in every situation. And I am not for a moment questioning the power of increasing levels of vulnerability. I'm not questioning that and the courage it takes to muster it, but I am suggesting that in our broken world, opening ourselves to the possibility of hurt should be approached with thoughtfulness and care. Vulnerability isn't just openness to being hurt. Sometimes even more frightening is the openness to being misunderstood. And it happens so quickly. When we played the game of telephone as kids, you remember the game, it didn't take 20 iterations to screw up the message. It usually took one. Imagine how quickly our story gets distorted when we share even the smallest part of it. Vulnerability may be key to our understanding of each other, but what it opens is more like a dynamic and moving maze than it is like a hallway. And when we produce developmental solutions or answers to our deepest questions that are based on a reality of personal hurt and brokenness, but assume we are interacting with a well-intentioned and complete world around us, we miss the reality that relationships with others are keys to both our redemption, oh boy, and to our misery. But I have faith that there is hope. It's some powerful combination of thoughtfulness, intention, sacrifice, vulnerability, courage, humility, and a willingness to edit that is likely the solution to our search for a better and more whole version of ourselves. And by the way, to more trust, because we have to approach this, we have to know ourselves and share ourselves with others with intention and care in order for them to know us, because they have to know us to trust us. And we have to know the same about them. And it's messy. I personally believe that it requires God as the source of our ultimate redemption, but that we each have a role to play in that process. And when our character is defined by our value as being more or less than others, here's the big deal: vulnerability becomes obsolete. And humility is almost always included in discussions related to character, but is rarely defined or described for the true controversy it raises, what humility raises. We use these related words, vulnerability and humility, interchangeably to describe character sometimes, but they function in different ways inside of each of us. We know character when we see it. We approach vulnerability when we experience it, and we are drawn to humility when others show it. They're each distinct and interdependent and not necessarily rewarded by our culture. And when we use them interchangeably, when we use vulnerability and humility and character interchangeably as if they're all just simple and the same, there's a problem that occurs. When we do that without discerning the difference between them, we fail to see the specific things we might need to change in ourselves or encourage in others. It no longer makes sense in our world's model of success and elevation because, by its very nature, it requires a descent. Humility requires that, an intentional decision to lower ourselves. Vulnerability requires that. This way of seeing our character calls us to put aside the worldview that success is the ultimate goal. Because vulnerability often comes at great risk, it requires us to muster up a sense of courage in times where it may be difficult to show vulnerability. Because choosing vulnerability in times where the path of ascent is easier requires courage. Because vulnerability, by its very nature, triggers reluctance and even fear. Courage is more than toughness. It's more than brashness or self-confidence. Its presence depends on fear. The presence of courage depends on fear. And in spite of our reluctance, courage is the strength we hold onto in those punch you in your gut moments of vulnerability. And in order to become vulnerable, we must evaluate and accept the risk of letting our guard down, to lower or raise the castle gates. And we got to invite others into our core insecurities and fears, because this opens up the door to the possibility of being torn down and exploited. Because it has that possibility, courage is absolutely necessary. Leaders must have courage, and that courage must be grounded in the realities and the fears of what is at stake for them and for those they lead. I want to finish with three or four questions. What leaders in your world have been vulnerable with you and lifted the veil on your idealized perception of them? And how did their courage impact you? How has vulnerability burned you in the past? And in what ways is that keeping you from being real with others around you? What false narrative is rolling around in the back of your mind that's derailing your capacity to be vulnerable with others? Because it is false, what is the more true story? And then finally, what is one thing that you are most afraid that others may discover about you that, if it were shared, may help you become the person that they need you to be?
Thank you for listening to this Wild Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.